He's a very bright guy. He spent a lot of time, he's a Brit, he spent a lot of time working with farmers in terms of how do you increase the value of their land in terms of yield and in terms of the value per acre. So it goes without saying that soil is a critical resource. It is the backbone of society, not only in terms of providing food and energy and materials, but it processes our waste. It's very important in terms of retaining water quality, and it acts as a huge buffer for climate change through these various feedback loops. And the fact of the matter is, soils store 3 times the carbon that both atmosphere and living plants have. It's second only to the oceans in terms of what it's able to store. It is absolutely the backbone of society. And people talk about the inconvenient truth around climate change, but the other inconvenient truth is really soil. And this is just another map that shows you the fact that there are degraded soils across the planet. And of course, we're here in the United States, and this shows you, I think, blue is water erosion, red is wind erosion, and so sorry guys, I still haven't got this fixed. There's a huge opportunity here in the Midwest in terms of how do we build up our soil health to avoid degradation. If you think about what happens when soils become depleted is they lose their carbon. They lose their soil organic carbon, because that's the backbone of a soil health. That you can almost visualize as a soil reef. The carbon provides the habitat for organisms, and it provides the ability to store and retain nutrients. And even though we're focused here in California around high-value crops, there is enormous opportunity here in the Midwest to think about how do we address land degradation and what are the resources we use to do that. And of course, I'm going to make the case that biochar is ideal for this. As I mentioned, people talk about peak oil. Peak soil is something that's getting increasing attention. In fact, it is, over almost half of our soils around the planet are experiencing some measure of loss of productivity. Over 15% of the soil really can no longer be used for farming whatsoever. And millions of hectares really have no ability to have any biological function right now. Talking with ag banks, back to biochar, they're interested in reducing risk around future degradation of soils. And they are intently interested in finding technologies that will restore soils because they want the farmers to pay back their loans. So if they can manage that effectively with things like biochar, then that's a win for everyone. But peak soil is an issue that you're going to hear more and more about. Just to give you some estimates, this global estimate suggests that there's 2,000 hectares, rather, 2 billion hectares around the planet that are in a state of severe degradation. And you can typically organize it according to water, wind, chemical degradation, or physical degradation. The vast majority is coming from from water. As you saw on that map, there were more blue dots than red dots, but 2 billion hectares around the planet. That's a really big number. That's close to 5 billion acres. And with the imperative, I think next week we're going to pass 7 billion people on the planet. There's going to be a huge imperative to grow more food. We have to decouple food and water security from deforestation, because what happens now in places like Indonesia and Brazil, as they are focused on palm and sugarcane production, is they're just cutting down more rainforests. But they're cutting down forests in areas that the soils are very unhealthy. So we need to find a way to restore soils. And as I said, this just isn't a problem in Africa and Asia and South America. In a study that John did in the UK, they worked with farmers to show that this was using compost. And compost is yet another form of organic carbon. They were able to increase the profits per hectare $150 per hectare. Just to give you a frame of reference, it's my understanding that the row crops, wheat, corn, typically yield between $200 and $400 per acre, whereas high-value crops yield between $1,000 and $3,000 per acre. So $100 per hectare, which is about $75 per acre, that's an impressive yield. If they're only getting $200 or $300 per acre to start with, That's a 25% increase in yield. And the impacts aren't linear because, and this is really one of the lessons of biochar and soil organic matter in general, it allows you to weather the dry years and the wet years far more effectively. It's not the mid-years that really matter, it's these extremes that we care about. And if you think about climate change, that's really what's happening now is weather's getting more extreme. Everything's getting more exaggerated. The wetters are getting wetter. The snow is getting snowier. It's windier. Everything is getting more amplified. And so if we can find technologies that allow you to address these swings in weather, that's very helpful. So this is a framework that will be published next month by a colleague of John's out of the UK. I believe he runs the UK Soil Service in terms of how do you think about land degradation. So up here you start with two basic categories, just the characteristics of the land. You know, the slope, where the soil is relative to the slope, and what are the climate characteristics. And then you talk about just basic land management techniques. Have you been a good steward of the land? Or are you being less than conscious in terms of how you manage the resources? And you have these threats. Decrease of organic matter, which is really the basis of healthy soils. Erosion, compaction, salinization. This is a big problem in California as these metals are in soils and allows it to be very ineffective in terms of providing what plants need. So then you lead to these degradation functions, whether it's the ability to process water effectively, whether you can retain nutrients, whether carbon is transformed effectively from an organic to an inorganic state, and then the actual physical structures of the soil itself. And all this leads to loss of goods, which I referred to earlier, whether it's food and fiber, whether it's carbon sequestration, or it's diversity. There's an attempt right now to formalize this framework so we can intervene in various places. Now, biochar would intervene right here because you assume that you would start with soils that weren't good. So here's the five basic benefits of biochar. You've got acidification. As I mentioned, if you create biochar the correct way, you could actually create a biochar that has a pH of 8 or 9, which would have a liming equivalency. This is very helpful in places that have acidic soils. If you think about loss of nutrient supply, because there's no organic content, biochar is an ideal matrix to retain nutrients because of its ability, because of its cation exchange ability, which then leads to increased performance and increased efficiency of fertilizers because the fertilizers don't run off. Just benchmark, we typically think that half the fertilizer you put on right now in soils rushes off because the soil doesn't have any ability to retain it. Farmers typically, they don't want to over-fertilizer, but they also want to make sure that the plants have enough fertilizer. Biological function. As I mentioned, and if you recall the view graph, biochar is an ideal substrate to retain and to accelerate the diversity of microbial communities. Soil structure, just the physical structure of the soils themselves is very helpful in terms of increasing drainage, aeration, and compaction. And finally, this runoff effect, which in California, at least in the Salinas Valley, that is the major threat for farmers, is they are being fined by the local environmental agencies for the runoff of phosphate and nitrogen fertilizers. And anything they can do to retain those nutrients not only increases their efficiency in terms of how they use their inputs, but they avoid the fines. So if you think about remediation, I've been speaking about agricultural soils, but biochar also is a very helpful component in terms of absorbing metals. Right now, for example, if you took some type of poison, I would give you a charcoal tablet, either a charcoal tablet or an EDTA tablet. Charcoal's been used for millennia as a way to absorb poisons, and the same thing applies to, for example, areas of mine tailings. So not only could you use biochar to address metal contamination, but then you provide the catalyst for restoration because, again, the basis of healthy soils is soil organic carbon, and that's what biochar does. I can think of a couple different examples where people are using biochar as a way to remediate or to restore woodlands with nurture raised trees. As I mentioned, all biochars are not the same, and this view graph will give you an example of what I'm talking about. So this is temperature on the x-axis. On the y-axis, I've got percent carbon recovery, I've got cation exchange capacity, I've got pH, and I've got surface area. So you can see as you raise the temperature of the kiln, these various parameters vary well. So look at pH. It starts off relatively low, and then it dramatically increases as a function of temperature, the same with cation change capacity or surface area. This is the yellow mark. You can't really see it here, but there does seem to be an optimum where if you're interested, for example, in surface area, it goes nonlinear from almost 0 surface area to almost 100. It's really quite incredible. And then if you're thinking about carbon recovery, again, the percent of carbon recovery varies dramatically in terms of temperature. So this is a thesis. This shows you directly, this is just one example of a woody feedstock where temperature dramatically affects what the quality of the biochar would be. This shows you some of the examples of increased yields from various crops. And these are studies that have been done in the last 5 to 6, 7 years, and shows you the input per ton per acre. And it's dramatic. And again, the benefit is dramatic when you start with poor soils. If you start with relatively good soils, you might see increases of yields of 25 to 30%. So in summary, the science behind biochar is being formalized as we speak. We've really only understood in the last 5 years how it works. There are so many researchers. The amount of literature produced and published every year has grown exponentially in the last 2 years. It's close to commercial breakthrough. Companies like ourselves are working with farmers to trial products, to iterate around their designs so they yield the benefits we care about. But the real successful deployment is going to be site-specific. Soils are so heterogeneous. Some soils will benefit with certain types of biochar. Some soils will benefit from other biochars. So there isn't any one solution. They're all optimized for the environment that you're in. But there is a huge opportunity for specific biochar product designs, which will then leverage the opportunity inside the ag space. I think this is John's a little bit of a confrontational guy, so this is an attempt to throw some ideas into the audience, which the fact is you guys have access to a really important feedstock, woody biomass, which is ideal for biochar production, especially on the commercial side. You can imagine making biochar from things like chicken litter, which would be great for retail products, but on the commercial side, people really don't want to use manure products in their fields. And so the real question is, how do we make it? Mark Coleman is going to talk about some of these mobile pyrolysis units, which are very interesting in terms of bio-oil production. They're not mature today, but I think there will be an opportunity here, but it really addresses the fact of, do you want to create bio-oil from biochar, or do you want to create an ag product from biochar? These are really two different paths that you can take in the fork of the road, and there's good reasons why you would want to do both. Right now, the real scale technology which exists, which I referred to in the Q&A, are these big units that process 50,000 tons of biomass per year in a kiln. And those are the ones where there's relatively low technology risk. But the real question is, how do we deploy these other smaller solutions for farmers that are out there, and what's the realistic cost of feed? We model in our business $50 per ton, because even if we can get free feedstock today, we know that's not going to be the case, and you have to be sensitive in terms of what you calculate in your modeling. I think that's what John has. So thank you for your time.